This podcast was recorded on May 6th, 2021. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and people outside the binary. Broken Class is now in session. I'm your discussion leader, Thomas Huda, and I'll start off really quick up front by saying that my guest, who has been so gracious to let me hang out in her backyard today, she has been fully vaccinated. I have been fully vaccinated with both the Pfizer shots against the COVID-19 virus. We wanted to make sure you knew that because we are bringing back the in-person podcast for this show. I'm excited about it.
I'm excited.
It feels good to be on the upswing of things in terms of the pandemic, but also being as cautious as needed when it's appropriate. So
glad.
Yeah.
So glad to be here.
So today I'm here with Rose Wilde. You are a candidate for re-election to the Lane Education Service District. I had to look off your cheat sheet. Well, I always knew it as Lane ESD, which thank goodness for acronyms, because otherwise we'd have to memorize words, and that's tricky sometimes. So that's exciting. And I want to ask you right off the bat, because we like to just get in and see who people are as human beings. What is a controversial opinion that you have about anything?
Well, I think that we need to invest in addressing historical inequities. I don't think it should be controversial.
Cut the camera. Cut the mic. This half-Japanese person will tell you that. That is absurdly controversial. It does seem that we shouldn't just assume that with the passage of time, those things have been alleviated. Seems like that's a lot of complacency.
Well, exactly. That's my reason for wanting to, is that we have documented evidence of all kinds of reasons why our state has treated people with color of all nations, all ethnicities, essentially anybody who wasn't white, unfairly. And it's had documented repercussions that echo through the years. So unless we intentionally restore and repair that harm, we're never going to get out of it. So I think we need to be very intentional around that. But I think that's something, actually, when you really get down into it, most people agree. Sometimes they get scared, but when you address the fears and talk about the reality of what it looks like, most people think it's a pretty good thing.
Yeah. And Oregon has this really interesting, whether it's paradox between being a very progressive place, people all over, people in the rural areas and in the urban areas, and of various socioeconomic status, people do tend to want what's best, but sometimes people will be so insular, and there's a lot of incentive to look at what's best for my family, my kid, my household, that maybe it's where the communication has broken down in terms of, it is good for all of us when we get rid of and when we eradicate these inequities and these inequalities.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that part of my journey and learning about racial justice was understanding what I had to gain from just freeing myself of white supremacy and historical inequalities. And it's just, there's so much to gain, that it's like having the truth and being able to interact with reality as opposed to a fiction that was created to maintain unfairness.
We talked on the phone a little bit to talk about what we're going to talk about. And you're very just boom, right to the point with the way that you speak. And that's refreshing, because sometimes you can tell that people who are in elective office or running for office are being as careful as they can with every single word. I believe that it's nice to it's good to be careful. I mean, I think I am very much that way, but man, if you're actually doing it to distort the reality of what you believe, then what's the point?
My history is pretty well documented, so I decided early on, when I realized I was going to have a competitive election and that people would be looking at me a little closer, that the best thing I could do is be honest about who I am. That in fact, I'm no good at lying anyway. And the truth is out there about me. I'm a committed anti-racist. And, I have my good days and my bad days. So, like they say, ally is a verb. But, I try to ally as much as I can. But more than that, I honestly and genuinely believe that I only have to gain by seeing the truth and the reality and letting go of false beliefs. Sometimes those beliefs are very subconscious. So I still catch myself all the time, and I go, gosh, where did that come from? Well, I know where it came from, but it just is a surprise sometimes to look in the mirror and realize that I still have biases trained that make me think of myself as superior because of my race. Right. And those are really uncomfortable truths. But I think the more that I've done that, the easier it's been to recognize and to let it go.
Right.
And then to interact with reality, which is a lot more fun place to be.
Right.
Yes.
I also think, Rose, that like when people put this on, let's say they're like, okay, this person's on my ballot. Here's an hour-long video on YouTube with 45 views, 2 likes. And they're like, I'm skeptical of this person. They're starting off talking about how they're an anti-racist. There is a lot of performativeness to the idea that because after this, all of these uprisings in 2020, that if you are on the left side of the spectrum, it's kind of like you have to like at least present yourself as though you are allied because that's what's seen as popular. But where in your background, let's say in your role as in 2 terms on Lane ESD, where have you fought for these issues?
Well, most recently, we, as a group of ESDs all around the state, we started a task force to address equity and racial justice. And it was a long time coming. And I think that some of the motivation to do it did come from the uprising. And so I see that uprising really provided an opportunity for folks who desired to push further on equity to really give a good, solid push. And we recently created I guess you'd call it a position statement that just expresses our values. And next term, I intend to be working on implementing actions related to that statement. So it's things like teach the full Oregon history. And we have lots of legislation and curricula in Oregon now that's starting to do that. But it's a matter of, well, how much are we going to invest? How hard are we going to push? How much are we going to promote doing this? And that's kind of where you start to see the boardsmanship and leadership skills apply, that you have to understand, how does a school district or school system work in order to implement new curriculum? And then how do you, as a board member, monitor that in a way that you're not getting out of your lane and getting into the weeds around the jobs of the professionals? And so that's what I'm excited to do, is to figure out what are the right things to be measuring and asking for reports on, and circling back continuously to see how we're doing.
I think that's the thing that stood out to me, is teaching the full history. It is really sad. I've known a lot of people who were in tears when they first learned Oregon was settled to be a white utopia, essentially, and sundown towns, and Black Americans and even Americans of color not even allowed to live in the state, having to, some of them worked on the near the California border or whatever, worked during the day and then had to leave and then come back. And Vanport, Oregon. Are you familiar with any of that history?
I am a bit. So yes, I am a bit familiar that it's a place where a lot of Black people came to live, and that the city essentially didn't protect it, and it was completely flooded and then seized for development, and they were pushed out of there. It was like a kind of almost like a disaster-based gentrification. I mean, I don't know if you read Naomi Klein, The Shock Doctrine, but it was kind of like there was that shock, that's, in this case, a natural disaster, which then sweep in, get the resources, get that land close to downtown, and push people further out.
Right. I think hopefully a podcast like this, what I like about it is I'm trying to get information out, not only because Lane County dropped the ball on printing a voter pamphlet, and now people have people on their ballots who they're trying to find information about, in whether it's an objective way or just a deep informative way. I'm trying to get that information out. And I think one thing that I worry about as a BIPOC person is, and I would say also as an LGBTQ plus person, is that messaging is a real challenge in society, and and I try to stay apprised of like what people are saying in conservative media, in far left media, in mainstream media, and I think that we've seen mobilization around. I mean, I would say even in our very local communities, but in South Lane and other places, around things like critical race theory is teaching white kids not to love their themselves, their history, teaching, taking their pride away, or things like, or they're raising a lot of critique about like trans women in all arenas of life, but in sports most recently. And I'm like, I think they might be winning. Like, I say that because maybe we're becoming more polarized, or maybe they've just been able to make people who are standing for these issues of justice, or what they view as these issues of justice, look absurd in rare cases, and they run this clip of this person looking absurd in front of millions of people.
That's why I'm glad we have an hour.
Yeah. But damn, what if we had a whole panel? Like, could we have like
Right?
more people like speaking to these? I tried to reach out to Holli Johnson, and I think that I'd reached out through an email form on the website, and everybody gets a lot of emails. So
Well,
I'd love to learn more about her at some point too.
Well, if I might tell her just briefly, because Holly and I have kind of teamed up a little.
Sweet.
So Holli Johnson works at Lane Education Service District, and she is the director of our African American and Black Student Success Plan and program. And she comes out of working at the University of Oregon and also several community colleges, and so she really knows, the K-12 educational system and the higher education system really well. And so she was recruited and encouraged to run for the vacancy at Lane Community College, and she was appointed in February. She was the first Black woman appointed or elected to that seat, and so she decided upon appointment that she would file to keep the seat and run in this election cycle. So that this has been an opportunity for Holly and I to work together. Both of us have a county-wide district. And many people have heard of Lane Community College. I think fewer have heard of Lane Education Service District.
True.
And so, but
well, they have a mascot. They're the Titans. You guys are the dorks who are giving out educational resources to the 14 districts.
I think there was a wolf pack.
Okay, sorry.
There was a wolf pack in one of our. We do have a couple of classrooms that operate essentially as independent schools, and I think they were the wolf pack, but I don't know if that kept up over the years. But
anyway.
the reason why I mention that is because both of us have low information, campaigns. Like there's just not a lot of information out, so we need to get information to voters. These are not high dollar elections. There's not people donating thousands of dollars to these elections.
Yeah.
And no voter guide. And so the biggest single expense is this little guy right here, our mailer.
And you printed like 50 signs because you were like, I don't have a big budget. Like, please take these pictures of the signs and spread them like wildfire.
I know. I felt a little sheepish about that.
That's good. I mean,
we could have afforded more signs. I just didn't know. And you have to order them so far ahead, and they're beautiful.
Yeah.
But so Holly and I teamed up to do this mailer. And I mean, even this little guy, just to send it to the people who we thought would vote and probably would vote for us, still cost us $7,000 just in postage.
Amazing.
And so Holly and I decided...
Union printed, I assume?
No, actually, the beautiful people at UFCW printed it, the United Food and Commercial Workers.
I do see a union bug on here, though.
Yes,
otherwise
of course.
People are going to get mad at you.
Of course. Oh, yes. It's it's actually literally printed by a union.
Okay.
And that does not have all of our endorsements because we had to go for the endorsements early in the game before we had them all in.
Right.
But we shared the expense on this, and we've done a few fundraisers together. And, it's not just to save money. I have been in office as an incumbent for several years. I think that I have we have some advantages to offer one another. And I wanted to make sure that qualified BIPOC candidates had a chance to win. And, Holly and I share a lot of values. We're well aligned. She's very well qualified for the position. Like, her race isn't an issue, save that people like her have historically been excluded and discouraged from these positions. And so I thought, well, if we can help each other out, and it does help me too, then that is very consistent with my values. And so that's been and it's actually, as I told you before, like, this stuff benefits me. My life is enriched by knowing people like Holly, and she's told me so much just in the context of getting to know each other better over the campaign, so that I feel like I can be a better board member and a better person. So vote Holli Johnson for LCC.
Yeah, I will definitely be voting for her.
Thanks.
And it also helps that I haven't seen much campaigning from either of the two people in her race, and I just think that in a local election, you got to run a campaign. You gotta do something. Like I ran for office previously, and I'm not going to talk about that at length. But I'm somewhat proud of how it went down in the sense that I didn't take any money. I was kind of like, I don't like campaign finance. I think there should be public funding of elections, and so live your values, you know. So I didn't ask for any money, but like, but at least I had a pretty robust social media effort. I had a website. I made an effort to get I had 64 policies on my website in 8 categories. Like,
that's impressive.
Well, I mean, whether it bore fruit or not, as coming in second out of 7 in that race, but also not getting a very large vote total. It's a learning experience for sure. But I think that I don't really understand people who. And I appreciate anyone who steps forward to run, but I don't understand getting into the race and people can't find anything about you. The register guard is calling and being like, "You want to talk about your candidacy?" and you don't want to. Like, it's like it seems to me, and I've got a question that I think can piggyback off this. That's a little antithetical with the idea of being a public servant. Is you're going to be in the shadows, but you're going to ask people to put you in a position to represent them. Because you've been an incumbent for a while, I think people really. It's really easy for people who are really well-intentioned to latch onto the idea that, like, hey, this person's an incumbent, get out of there. We need different voices in, you know? And you're saying, I've been on the board for 8 years. Here's why. Here's what I've fought for. Here's why I think you should reelect me. So what do you think about that instinct that people have that, like, whether it's drain the swamp or whether it's you guys aren't, living up to your progressive values that you talk about every campaign cycle, you know, how do you make that argument that you deserve re-election?
Well, I'd say look at my record, and more importantly, look at how's Lane ESD doing. I mean, when I came in, and now, you know, I'm campaigning, so I had to take credit for things that happened under my term, even though
How dare you?
We all know that I'm one of 7 board members with a very competent staff who have done these things. So that said, when I first joined Lane ESD, we were looking at losing Eugene School District 4J from our consortium, which would have been about a third of the budget. And through the hard work of our superintendent and the best that I could do as a new board member and many others also working towards this, we were able to bring 4J back in and then continue to have all of our component school districts be part of the ESD. And so that does kind of give you a little window into how we work. Like, our funding is 100% dependent on the local school districts being satisfied with what we do. And, you know, when we had that moment with Eugene School District where it looked like they weren't and they were going to take their funds and go, that was a real wake-up call to everyone. And we were able to work it out. We were able to provide a better service arrangement with Eugene School District, and also able to communicate with some of the leadership that had some ideas that they ended up changing as a result of that. That we've been proud to have 100% participation. And I'll also say that
that's awesome. Because Lane has probably some school districts that think very differently from one another. I would say, you know, whether it's in does Dune City have one, or Monroe, or I don't know the names of all of them. I know Springfield and then 4J and Bethel because they're all in Eugene and Springfield.
Yeah, there's Florence. There's the school district in Florence called Sayusla and Mapleton, and we've got Oak Ridge and Junction City, and then there's I'll always miss one, but there's school districts that are just a few hundred to I think 17,000. So there, and I think in total there's something like 45,000 in the county. So there's a lot of diversity, and they're all locally governed, and so they do have really different local cultures. So we don't govern those districts; they govern themselves. But we figure out what are the services that will help them meet their educational needs. And we're all in the same state, and we all have the same standards, and so a lot of the things we can find relevance across all 16. But we also give our districts options. Some things we do for everybody. We call those our core services. And some things are more like a menu where you say, well, I'd like to have this, this, and this. Like I'd like to have some slots in your special education program because we have students with particular educational needs that you could help us meet. That's going to vary from year to year.
Yeah. I appreciate that answer. You always have such well thought out answers, and I'm just over here like cracking jokes.
Well, I will say that is experience.
Yeah.
You know,
Boom! Look at that tie-in. But I can think about something that a lot of people, whether they're local or they just are like my homie from college who like tunes into this, because I went to college in Minnesota. There's like a national conversation around education as well that happens. And there was a lot of attention paid to, let's say, the previous education secretary, Betsy DeVos, and now the new education secretary under Biden, whose name escapes me. Can't remember his name.
Well, I don't know now either.
Yes, yes.
I'll think of it in a minute. Yes.
Okay. Because I was going to say, to what extent, maybe that actually is pretty revealing and will be encouraging for some people who don't like too much federalization. Like, to what extent is Lane ESD affected by those changes in federal policy?
Oh, we're affected.
Sure.
Absolutely. Federal policy.
Because basically, I'm trying, like, in lay people's terms, a lot of people are like, the dang local community should decide what's going on in the schools. And some people feel that there's limitations to that.
Well, nothing's ever just a yes or no question, right? So, my stepfather used to work in the U.S. Department of Education, and he has some very revealing stories about why you need to have some kind of federal oversight, and that the civil rights of students all across the United States were just simply not being met. And the federal government had to intervene, and not just in the 1950s and 60s, but all throughout history to this day. There's still a federal office of civil rights that is in the Department of Education where people bring those concerns, particularly if they haven't been addressed at a local level. And so I think that we do need some kind of backstop to protect our constitutional and civil rights. The federal government doesn't tell us what to teach.
Right.
But we set our own standards.
People get really like Common Core was a big one under the Obama years, for example, that people talked about, and also under the Trump administration. And first of all, they didn't realize that was only for English and mathematics. It was only those two things. And it wasn't federal. It was actually an association of governors. And so
we're part of it. We bought in. We decided we wanted to buy into that. And there were some reasons.
Yep.
I am not on a PhD in education to delve into the ins and outs of the curriculum. And
Talk to me in like 8 years. I'll be there.
Yeah, right.
I'll still be like goofy and weird, but I'll have like a little more credential.
Yeah. Well, the arguments in those days had more to do with consistency about what the value of a diploma implied. And that when you have a diploma from any place in the United States, it means certain basic things. Now, at the time that we adopted that, I was fairly new. I didn't know some of the kind of deeper analysis to understand the movements in education that have been happening. And so now I might have a more critical response. So at the time, it was the State Board of Education decided to adopt Common Core. So we didn't really have a choice. That was not a decision we got to make, really. We gave it our official rubber stamp, but no was not an acceptable answer.
Okay, yeah.
So
yeah.
I'd say now that I am a little more tolerant of regional variations because we have different regional cultures, we have different regional economies. But, English and math being fairly consistent, it's not terribly controversial to me.
Yeah,
I think what we want to be careful about is getting into sort of a cookie cutter approach to education that interferes with the teacher's ability to teach. That really, I think what happens in a classroom is this kind of beautiful synergy with a teacher at the center. And we often get in the way when we don't need to and don't have to. I think light accountability structures that do catch when something we're doing isn't working is necessary. And the authority to intervene when things are way out of balance is necessary for fairness. Like, we need to have our civil rights protected. But I'd say that beyond that, really, we should give our teachers an idea of what we want kids to know and then let them use their art and their talent and their skill.
Cool. Yeah. I think other people who are on the ballot would really resonate with that statement in terms of letting teachers be teachers, to the extent that, everybody should recognize that, hey, this is a professional job. Yeah. These people are very credentialed at what they do, and there can be a diversity of styles. I had teachers who were some of the most strict and fierce people you could ever imagine, who were some of the best teachers that I ever had. I also had teachers who really promoted a classroom culture of whether it's compassion or just like laid back energy. That was really necessary for me at times as well. And I still learn from both of those people. Richard Diaz. And I went to North International High School and we had some real fun times. Absolutely. Another conversation that gets brought up is school choice. And really the argument there is essentially that some people are really wanting public education to be really strong and wanting to make sure that, well, maybe you could explain a little better so I don't make sure I get something wrong. But essentially, there are a lot of communities who say our public schools have failed us. We want the opportunity to send my kid to somewhere else where I don't live. And then other people say that it's better for the community and cohesion and maybe for the public schools getting the resources that they have rather than having resources funneled to other places, that people, if you're in this area, you go to this school.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's not going to be a right answer that's going to be universal.
Sure.
Because as we've seen, with time and technology changing, like more things are possible than they used to be. Now, that said, I am definitely a fierce proponent and protector of public education.
Yeah.
And I think that there are aspects where we are not succeeding as well as we should, and that there needs to be some way to address that when it's not working.
Right.
And so that's a place where I'm constantly trying to learn and explore because I don't necessarily know that. But what I will say is to challenge the narrative that says that U.S. education is failing. If you look at the data on the schools that are doing better in other countries, their child poverty rate is like half or a third or a quarter of ours.
Yeah.
And that you have to look at the whole picture of what's happening in the United States and with families. That if those kids are hungry and distracted and unstable housing and trauma and community violence and everything else going on, well, yeah, it's going to be harder. Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
And we're a much more heterogeneous society than some of those other countries. People talk about Finland, and it's like, well, they're mostly white European Finns.
Yeah.
I mean, and they have a social democracy where there's very little child poverty.
Right.
So if you compare the kids that have similar incomes, we're doing great.
Yeah.
I don't think that's not a get out of jail free card. I mean, we need to do a better job of teaching all the kids regardless of how they come. But also that's why I like the ESD, because we are a little bit more cross-sector in our capacity to work in the communities. We're not only working with schools. We're also working with businesses. We're working with Bureau of Labor and Industries. We're developing programs that will fuel the next generation of our economy. So there's kind of a relationship there.
I think that one thing, talking about industry a little bit, maybe strengthening connections between, let's say, career and technical education is something that, my new friend Laurel O'Rourke cares about a lot,
Yeah.
And I think that I appreciate, as somebody who, I'm half Japanese, right? And I love my mom. She didn't go to college. She got a high school education, and she was very strict about me going to the... I mean, there was an extent to which she was like, go wherever you're going to be happy, but you will be happiest at the most elite school you can go to. And, I had a really stressful senior year, and I had applied to a bunch of places that I got waitlisted at a bunch of like big brand name schools or whatever. And because my grades had tanked because I was so stressed out. And I ended up going to Carleton College, which was already like an experience of going there and feeling like, oh, everybody around me, their parent is like a doctor, a lawyer, or a professor. That's different. My dad's homeless. My mom's a sushi server. That's a different experience.
Wow.
I think that what I appreciate is, okay, take the foot off the gas pedal. Let these kids be human beings. Also recognize that they got to be able to have some skills, skills before bills is what Laurel says.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate, because Princeton, Yale, Amherst, they're all going to be fine. They're still going to get the people who have the tiger parents that really want their kids to go there, and like, you better get a 34 plus on your ACT and blah blah blah. But let's also like give students a chance to have some skills, whether they don't pursue higher ed or have technical and vocational training. Where is ESD fitting into that picture?
Oh, so much.
Yeah.
I mean, so it sounds like you and I had a similar experience with that. There was kind of a vocational track and a college track. And you couldn't move between the two once you chose or went in a direction. And sometimes it was chosen for you. And now career and technical education prepares you for college while preparing you for a industry related career. And so some professions, like let's say your aspiration is to be, a physician or a doctor, right? That there's lots of higher education you have to get.
Yeah.
But you can still do a program that you would come out and be able to get a job as a medical assistant, start working on some of maybe you could get a licensed role eventually, like you could be an LPN, that kind of job where you are able to earn more than you would if you just had a high school diploma. Mm-hmm. And you'd be able to compete for more exclusive and more well-paying jobs. And I think about myself, like I was college track only, and go to the best school you could get into. Again, similar experiences. Yeah. But what did I do the whole time?
Congrats, you got into Rice. There you go.
Yeah.
Best school in Texas.
I got a big brain on this one.
Oh, you do. Let's be real.
That's actually how I got my first job.
You were like, take that, Marty. I don't know what you... Sorry. But competitiveness is totally there.
I'm going to say this for everybody to hear now. Marty's smarter than me. All right, Marty, you got it.
Oh, no. Why would you admit that? Wherever Marty went, I'm sure it's a lovely place. Wow, that sounded condescending. Rewind that back. Marty went to a great school, dang it. All right.
Marty went to all public schools.
For people who don't know, Marty Wilde is the state representative for House District 11 in the Oregon House of Representatives.
He's got a crazy big brain,
he's your bro.
It's about me. I'm smart. I'm smart enough for me. That's what I say. Mm-hmm. But that my whole point about that was that I worked for minimum wage all through high school and college.
Bingo.
And we
understand each other.
Yeah, right. But also, it's kind of like maybe I could have actually had a few skills and worked for a little bit more than minimum wage through high school and college. I mean, why is it that I'm going to this elite school that's, very similar experiences and yet, barely being able to pay my rent? It's a real strange, it's a strange world. So what I like about career and technical education is that you now are in our Oregon way, you can do both. And it helps increase our graduation rates. People who take CTE courses, even just one, are way more likely to graduate. And I think some of the magic is that you get people that are really passionate about the work that they do, and they need to get a teaching credential, but not as lengthy a process to get the CTE teaching credential. So we help people navigate those paths so that they can actually teach for credit in high school in a CTE coursework. And we take our already certified teachers and help them get matched up with an industry experience over the summer. They call it an externship. And so
nice.
Like one of them went and worked at a computer programming place, and he learned all about games and software and like just, I've already exhausted my vocabulary about that, but I didn't go that direction. But they did, and then they were able to come back and they were able to teach. They were teaching like a computer science course, but they were teaching it from a very theoretical approach. And now they were able to talk about like, this is the cool stuff that you can do, and this is what you need to know and be able to do, and like bring in the arts and the math and the science and the engineering and all the different pieces and apply that to a real world situation. And so it brings together people who've had really different approaches to their education and puts the two together. And for students, it's just a magic combination. They're excited, they're interested, they see relevance, and they potentially have a skill they can use immediately after high school, as if they are, start a family young, just need to be working in order to support themselves, or others have caregiving responsibilities. Like not everybody can just be a full-time student right out of high school. So I think that's a reality, is to look at, what do people need to be successful, and what are the different paths that they can take. So I like it. I'm sold. Lane ESD sold me on career and technical education.
Nice. Awesome. Yeah. And I think like a lot of the really wonderful, we talked about Oregon history and like how people, some people really want to defend it. And I think one of the really, there's a powerful, Oregon has always been a place with people who work hard and are industrious, and I think that like, that them feeling left out of the conversation allowed for someone to run for president in 2015, 16
and
say, I'm the one who's fighting for you guys. I see you guys. And we need to recognize that like people who like get their hands dirty and work in that kind of way, like hell yeah, like power to you. Like I admire that, you know? And you're not lesser because like I read this awesome text in my, history 305 class or whatever.
Yeah. Who's going to survive the, complete collapse of society? It's not going to be the nerds, right? Well, maybe, but it's because they have figured out how to grow food and how to get clean water.
Right.
Absolutely. I mean, these are things that are not so far away as we think. Like these are skills we need.
But the nerds can make cloned meat. I want to do that. I want to eat that. That sounds really cool.
That's right.
It's one of those interesting ethical like situations. A cow didn't die, but it is beef. Like, should you eat it? I don't know. I'm a meat eater. But I actually think like culturally for me, like fish, oh my gosh, such a big part of my heritage. I wish that we weren't overfishing. So
I hear you there.
Actually, honestly, food is it's one of those basic human needs. And that's one of those times where it's like, your idealist, ethical views of the world come right up against I gotta eat, or I gotta have this thing to survive. That's an interesting thing. We could probably go into that for a little while.
Well, that is an industry that we look to for jobs. Also, that's one of the sectors of our local economy that kids can get into. I mean, I came from my dad was a farmer. I didn't decide to go that route, but there's a lot to know. I mean, about how to be successful, about how to create markets, about how to, work with others. And he was a really small time farmer, but managed to make a living through my whole life. And now there's this whole economy around here. We got a great climate for growing things. And so, and who doesn't love going to the farmer's market and being a part of that community? And I try to eat the local food. I try to stay connected in that way. Yeah, you were talking about being proud of your history, and I understand that. Like some of my relatives, all of my relatives were colonists. They're colonizers who came to places that, were cleared through genocide, through disease, through wars of the native population, and then benefited from the economic impact of slavery, which every single American benefited from, whether they own slaves in their family or not. It's like a foundation of our economy for decades. So it absolutely, every single one of us. And so, knowing that reality, like I didn't do those things, I wasn't there. I wasn't born, we're doing the best with what we have where we are now.
Yeah.
And yet I can still acknowledge that there's been advantages that came to me because of that history. Like my family on the Wilde side, they moved into land that had previously belonged to the Klickitat tribe. And, I think part of like what's fascinating is just to look at those stories and to say, like at one point I might have said, oh, they were pioneers and I'm so proud of them and they had hard work and all that. And it's like, that's also true.
Yeah.
And it's that they were able to do that because somebody else drove off the people who lived there. Now there are still Klickitat people in that area.
Kalapuya here.
There's still Kalapuya here. Yes. Yeah. So I don't mean to imply that they're completely gone. However, that land was not ours to take and we took it.
Right. That's so beautiful what you said, because I'm 27. I grew up seeing the evolution of social media. I love social media. I think there's some perverse and like questionable like interests in terms of, like, have you watched that documentary, The Social Dilemma?
No, I think I didn't want to know.
Yeah, that's one of those things we don't want to know.
For someone who loves education.
Consume.
Yes.
And that was a little maybe uncomfortable. Yeah. But like, okay, there's so much brevity and there's so much promotion of brevity. Like you write a smaller message, the font is bigger. Like I remember when that happened, I was like, what? They're trying to make us have like shorter messages. And
a little less from you, please.
And so the reason, and that's fair. I've got
subtle.
Those people like they be posting essays, not links to PDF, like in the actual post is that. So, but here it is. You said it so easily, because if you take the first part of this thing, you said, I wasn't the colonizer. I didn't do that. That's gonna be loved by some people and hated by other people. Just that statement. Then you got the other part of the statement, which is I benefit from a legacy of white supremacy and terrorism, like against communities.
Yes, absolutely.
So that it's gonna flip. So the same people who hated the first one are gonna love that one, but it's the reality is in the recognition of both of those things.
Well, and also being able to learn that.
But you can't post that whole paragraph and have it get as much retweets as the little.
For real.
Lauren Boebert is a congresswoman, and
let's see. Why do I know
I
that
just
name?
really am just I don't want to just hate read, and I that's the term, but I don't have hatred for people, right?
Yeah.
But I see the tweets and I'm like, everyone's just trying to act like 45. Everyone's just trying to act, and it's just like these little quips, and they're so freaking. The truth is so lost when you reduce to a 5-word thing.
I am not made for sound bites. It's funny because my cat's off camera here, but the last time I was interviewed by a TV news station, it was about this big, huge event that was happening. Oh, it was when the God, Guns, and Trump rally was downtown, right by the Saturday market, and we were organizing some counter protests. And we had like this 20-minute interview where they, I think, had 5 words, and more time was spent on my cat who walked through the scene. So
oh my gosh,
she's locked up for now.
right.
Because that they and they know their audience. They know what people want to, what people enjoy in that medium, and what they have been trained to appreciate and to look for.
Right. And I think there's a culture also of like, so a lot of people are like, wow, the world feels unstable. I feel, and as human beings, as mammals, we think that we are under threat when things occur that are unfamiliar or destabilizing. And so why I say that is because the progressive left looks at those media outlets and says, this is so corporatist and so unable to tell the real stories and so reductive and so soundbitey and not reflective of us. Even when you come and cover our events, you do it in a way that relies on a framing that is too simplifying or whatever. And then the conservative right looks at those and says, this is such a liberal area and you guys are just keep covering these Black Lives Matter rallies and this is such a liberal media. And then the two sides go whoop, and that's one of those things that makes me, because they both basically feel like it doesn't represent them and it's actually against them. And that is one thing that is a real concern of mine, is that we don't just disagree, we hate each other. We don't just disagree. We think that the other side is an existential threat to us. And sometimes it is. Sometimes it is. I'm not saying it's never an existential threat.
But maybe less often than we might think. And I'll tell you, like doing this task force on racial justice and equity, the representatives came from all corners of Oregon, and they had a lot of ideas about themselves and what others might think about them. And there was a lot of that rural or urban sort of tension of that some of the more populous counties would be kind of holier than thou, or that some of the less populous counties would have, be racist. I mean, these were fears that they articulated, that you're going to think I'm like this, but that's not what I'm like. But when I vote against this particular language or this sort of thing, it's because, in my region, it has this context. And we took several months to come up with that, and we really made a lot of time for those conversations. And I was so nervous. I mean, when we start, part of the reason why people don't do this work is because they're afraid it's going to blow them apart. And I was so nervous when we decided to do this. I was the chair of the governance council, and we're saying we're going to do this. And, I was afraid it wasn't going to work, that we would hate each other. But, because this is a group of folks that has worked together, that has some history, that has linked arms over other issues in the past, and it is unified by our care of kids, and periodically remind ourselves of that. It helps to remind ourselves of that. We really were able to have some of those uncomfortable conversations, and I found myself pleasantly surprised. Now, I didn't say that at the beginning. I was like, this is going to work. It's going to be great. I have confidence. But, I was worried. And so it was really a beautiful thing to see people really rise to the occasion, and it's like sometimes I can be a little holier than thou, and that needs to be checked. So that's like
I'm so experienced as that so often.
And it's not helpful. I'm not proud of it.
And I feel like I'm not. I feel like I'm so down to earth. I'm of the people, and it's bro, come the hell on. Well,
sometimes I get scared. I'm afraid I'm not going to get what I think I need, and I become inaccessible. But I think that when we're able to relax and to not be afraid of being attacked, You know, like if I thought you were going to edit this into a soundbite and use it to destroy me, then, you know, I mean, I suppose people can do that these days, just taking your video, but such is life. You know, like I said, the horse is out of the barn with me. You know who I am. And I just have to be myself. I have to live with that. And we have to, I think, trust people a little bit better, that given the chance to have relationships with one another, they will treat each other better than we see on social media or on TV. Yeah. You know, Cokie Roberts said that.
I don't know who that is.
Cokie Roberts was a news reporter. I think she passed away just recently, but she was the daughter of a senator, I think. And she said that back in the old days, the Democrats and the Republicans, their kids would go to school together. They would have, you know, softball games. Like, it's like, sure, they might duke it out in Congress, but then after hours, you know, they all went to the same cocktail parties and their kids went to school and they knew each other. They had dinner to get together. And she said that hasn't happened in a long time.
Yeah.
And so it's that. And she said part of that, you talked about drain the swamp, it said, it became, under Trump especially, the whole drain the swamp idea, unfashionable to spend any more time in D.C. than you needed to be. They shortened the calendar of the week so that it was not as advantageous to put down roots in the D.C. area and live there while serving your term. And so people would go back home every weekend and they wouldn't form relationships with one another. And that made polarization that much easier. And it's amazing how these little subtle things like making your work week shorter in the Congress to facilitate folks just not forming relationships.
You just flipped something for me so beautifully, because I think, Ron Wyden should be here. Peter DeFazio should be here. I think about that all the time. But at the same time, we tend to elect them because we know that they do know our community and they know what's going on here. Of course they're connected. Of course they have an office and staff here and they're here. But also, why wouldn't you want those people to be working with their peers, often who don't agree with them, whether within the party or across the aisle? And I didn't know about that issue. I did know that you're familiar with Tulsi Gabbard, former representative from district in Hawaii, and she had talked about how she basically had been scoffed at and looked at by fellow Democrats as what are you doing by simply the act of being friendly and hanging out with Republicans. And gosh, like, in what world do we really think that pure adversarial culture is going to get us better results for the whole country?
Yeah.
for foreign policy, for anything?
Well, flipping it back to education, it's that's the opposite of what works. Like I don't think that competition has much of a place in our educational system, and I can still see lots of places where that's a factor, but that, you know, really in life,
she's trying to take away your sports, everybody. This is it.
Well, you know what? Lane ESD doesn't oversee any sports.
It's going to say 50-50 at the end of every game. I'm just joking.
Well, competition is fun.
Yes.
And that can be motivating and, you know, all of that. But what I'm talking about is competition, like setting up schools as in a kind of capitalistic model, which is what the kind of reform effort is about, is kind of introducing these false ideas of competition. You talked about charter schools and privatization and this whole idea that schools compete against each other. And if, you know, this school isn't good enough, well, then the parents will send their kids to another school, which sounds great because we've all been indoctrinated into, you know, capitalism. But
go off, Rose.
But what really happens is that, like, some kids can't leave and those schools just fall apart. So, you know, all the schools should be excellent, and we need to keep working on what's the best way to get to that. I mean, I don't think I have all the right answers, but I am at least willing to hear the critique.
So many people feel like it's a zero-sum game, and I can't fault them all for that, because it does feel so much like if this school is underperforming, like, and you're allocating more resources to them, then my school, where I send my kid who's been doing great, is losing out. And how do you actually convince? Because I talked to, one thing I mentioned with Laurel is I think sometimes our side, our team, to the extent that I think that's a thing, isn't focused enough on persuasion. How do you persuade people to go with what you've been talking about for this whole 45 minutes plus is, I win when the people around me who don't look like me, who don't speak the same languages as me at home, who you know, may not have the same gender identity as me, when they win as well, or succeed or thrive.
Well, when the pie is too small, it's hard to cut everybody a generous slice, right? So I'm a big fan of bigger pie. and
Nice.
In Oregon, up until the Student Success Act passed, we underfunded schools about 20% shy of what we should, by our best guess of what it would cost to give kids a pretty good education, is the way we talk about it, a quality education model. And we made a big jump when we passed the Student Success Act, and we targeted it towards certain things, but had it flexible enough that most school districts could use it.
I talked to Julie Fahey, representative of House District 14, about that. I just give these little intros just to show that I know what districts people serve. And I was like, why was that a party line vote in the House? And she said it was a party line vote in both chambers, and I'm glad it got done. And it needs to continually be something. It authorized a bunch of funding for schools, and I know you've been working in having somebody like specifically with ESD doing implementation on that. But it's sad. Yeah, let's get bigger pie, please. It should be something we agree on. Yeah.
I can't speak to it, but I have yet to find a tax that Republicans will vote yes on. So until we can cross that bridge, I don't know what else to do. So
do you have any sympathy for, I know that is it's a hardline position, but to say like all taxes are bad or something, but like are you sympathetic at all to like, okay, people move to Idaho because they really do feel like the tax burden in Oregon is too high, and they do feel disempowered in deciding where that money goes, and the wages that they make as human beings are not sustaining them enough, and the cost of living and everything is going up, inflation's going up. I'm sympathetic to that idea that taxes, when you have limited time to get educated about a race because you're working your 3 jobs and raising your 4 kids and whatever it is you may be having some passion or thing on the side, like it is an easy thing to say that's a tax, therefore it's bad. But your response.
We could find a lot of money by just getting rid of the tax expenditures, which is the taxes we don't collect and we give away. Like I'm not super fond of tax exemptions, and mostly those benefit already very well off people or corporations.
Yeah.
So I'm not a revenue expert, but what I will say is they spent a long time trying to figure out what would be a good strategy for raising money. And they had to take into account the culture of Oregon and people's feelings around taxes and what they'd be willing to pass. And even with all the compromises, they still couldn't get a single Republican vote, and including, ones that were on school boards, and that was very disappointing to me. But I understand. I don't think anyone was corrupt in their vote. I think they voted their beliefs and their values. And yet we needed the money to come from somewhere, and they weren't really coming up with any viable alternatives. Or the alternatives were things that would really grossly overtax the lowest income folks, so flat taxes, things like that. It's like, I'm in favor of a progressive tax. I'm in favor of if you make more money, you pay more money. Corporate activity tax, that's sort of a new thing to me, but it's not the only state that has one.
Right. Well, AOC is somebody I admire. I don't agree with her all the time. I admire her tenacity and I think her sincerity. And I think, she brought up marginal tax rates a year or 2 ago and said something about 70%. And everybody was like, you're going to tax my money at 70%. And just the simplest, and I'm an idiot when it comes to taxes sometimes. Marginal tax rate means that it's every dollar after a certain point is taxed at that rate, and you're not going to get to that point. Like, maybe you've got a really cool business and you think you're going to be a multimillionaire soon, but like, you're probably not.
It's your second $10 million,
but then can't we like do something about it? And you're on the ESD. Let me get fired up now. What are you doing to get these people educated about taxes? A lot. It's so easy to point to. I don't know even how well it is accurate to us locally, but like, people don't know how to do their taxes. People don't know the what are the other things I'm thinking of? But like, they always talk about like whether it's home ec or these really like tangible life skills things that aren't necessarily the academic or certainly not the liberal arts things, but like, what do I need as a human being? as an adult?
Well, I mean, they have
talked about that a little
finance
bit.
classes and things like that. Okay. Finance classes, or they say consumer finance, and I think
there's a tweet. I remembered it now. It's like, shut the hell up and square dance. Why don't I know how to? Why don't I know how to do my taxes? Shut up and square dance.
I know.
Didn't mean to cut you off.
No, it's okay. I'm like, you're gonna have to ask a PE teacher about square dancing. I'm sure there's a reason, but yeah, I don't know what it is. Maybe it was to get like boys and girls to touch, like in like socially sanctioned ways. Who knows? It was awkward. That's all I remember about it.
Right.
But yeah. I mean, understanding taxes for sure. Well, I've had to learn a lot. I'll tell you, it's like a whole day. Just if you go to a conference, you can do a whole day on school finance just to understand what goes into all the schools, because it's complicated. So I'm not going to do that in 3 minutes that we have left. Yeah. But what I'll say is that our schools, we're paid for a combination of income tax and property taxes, essentially.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
Yeah.
I will not let you off the hook without talking about music, though, because I always ask people who are in public service about music that on a personal level, and I think people have gotten a sense of you as a person, and I like that. What really inspires you and what's important to you
musically.
Yeah. And I like to hear artist names.
Well, like I was saying, I've never heard of anyone before we started this interview, and it's true. Like I developed my interest in musicians pretty early on, and I've just stayed loyal. So I listened to everything the Indigo Girls ever did. They're probably my favorite, and you can just kind of go down that theme.
I can't name one song. I know that they exist.
I probably know all the words to most of their songs.
Sweet.
And they're like Dylan, they write like, it's not just a chorus verse. It's like, no, the chorus is different every time.
Nice.
So yeah, poetry
cool.
They're my favorite, I'd say.
So Young Rose was into the Indigo Girls.
Yeah, and Old Rose.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm,
okay.
Mm-hmm,
all right.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any? Because for me, I understand that we all live.
We're gonna go see the Flaming Lips. We just found out they're gonna be at the Crystal Ballroom
next
year.
Oh my gosh.
We're like, pandemic is definitely gonna be over in a year, right?
Yes.
Right. So yes, we're going to see the Flaming Lips, which are so much fun.
Hey, here's a current news update. This will come out in a couple days, but the U.S. finally said we're gonna restrict patent rights for the vaccine, essentially, so that not the big pharma corporate giants can be the only ones that produce these vaccines, and that of course benefits us because developing nations and people all over the world will have much easier access. Places that have had a really hard time, India, I'm praying for y'all. That's been a really, really difficult. I've been hearing harrowing stories.
Yeah.
And so that's exciting that's going to be happening.
Pandemics don't know borders. I used to work in HIV and AIDS services, and so and have a degree in public health, and so it's been an interesting time for that. And yes, pandemics don't know borders. So if there's any place where the coronavirus or whatever the next pandemic is able to continue to infect folks, it'll just keep coming back. So there's no point in these, hoarding of vaccines. And I actually think that, a stronger World Health Organization should have been putting these agreements in place from a public health perspective much sooner. You got to look and decide what are the values that you're going to use. And in terms of how you're going to roll out vaccinations, and then you do those. It's like, for example, Oregon decided to put educators at the beginning of the line. A lot of other states didn't do that.
Yeah.
Was that right? Was that wrong? Well, it depends on your definition of right and wrong, right?
Yeah.
It's complicated. We decided we wanted to have our educators able to return to the classroom sooner, so that our kids could get back into school and mostly benefit from the social opportunities. It's not so much for academic. There's some academic gains, but socially was where it's at. Those kids, I mean, I've got a 10-year-old inside, and he's been missing his friends. So.
Yeah, he just has to play him on Among Us. You're saying that's what he's up
to. That's right. His main social engagement has been he's figured out how to use Zoom for social purposes. So I'm proud of him. He's learned something new. But I'd like for him to actually breathe fresh air. be outside, run around.
Is he coming to the Flaming Lips show?
No.
Yoshimi battles the pink robots. He's not gonna be in there.
He was in my belly at the McDonald Theater before he was born.
Nice.
But
for what show?
Oh,
do you remember?
Well, it was the Flaming Lips.
Oh, it was.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Oh,
Nice,
yeah.
nice.
Yeah.
Cool.
So yeah, I still remember. Like, can he feel that in here?
Yeah. Well, Crystal Ballroom is a little bouncy. You might have felt that.
It's a little
bouncy
bouncy.
If you were there, if you had been there.
Yeah.
But I'd mentioned that, we all live different lives or whatever, but like, I just can't imagine someone not being into any hip hop at all. And I'm not saying that you're not into any hip hop at all, but, maybe because I'm a rapper, but before I was a rapper, I was just like, oh, this is like the greatest thing ever. Like, not just the best music ever. This is like the greatest thing ever. And, I think about hip hop, not every day, but every half hour.
Nice.
On some level.
Nice.
And
I think this is an area where I'm kind of almost a blank slate. I did enjoy the Grammys this year.
Cool.
And I did start looking into, is it Megan Thee Stallion?
Megan Thee Stallion.
Yeah. I liked that. I loved in the Super Bowl, was it J-Lo and Shakira?
Okay.
Yeah, together.
Yep.
And like I studied
years ago.
Yeah, I studied anthropology. Yeah, it was a couple of years ago. I studied anthropology, and so for me, I'm always kind of like, where's that coming from? And so I'm like watching hip hop, and I'm seeing like all the like deep cultural roots. And so yeah, I'm kind of naive, I guess, not very well exposed. But I would say that I especially now that I kind of understand more.
Yeah.
That, kind of where is this coming from? Where are the lives? Or like, who are these people, know, in like all their history? Like Beyonce, I like Beyonce. I know, like, I've never really liked it. I'm not cool.
Oh, you just watched her Super Bowl thing too? Okay, fine. I had a chat in the early days of this podcast back when it was called Less Stupid, which I think is a less good name for the podcast.
But we like that also.
Okay. It's with a woman named Amia Nectar. She's a local musician in town. She sings R&B and she's a really wonderful person. And she's a black woman who was talking with me about that J-Lo and Shakira halftime show performance. And one thing she brought up was that she was like loving that they were so empowered as women who I think are like in their 40s and the proclaiming of their sexuality.
Yeah.
That's something that so many freaking BS media influences and sources are like saying isn't like appropriate or palatable or whatever.
Yeah.
And absolutely puritanical. And so I think it's cool that like you brought up Megan Thee Stallion. She's incredibly assertive about sexuality in her music
Love
too.
it. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
And it's like, yes, like let's and you might have heard about Kendrick Lamar in the curriculum, like being taken out at North Eugene and puritanical is a good way to put it because it is a clear outgrowth of and Maya talked about this on my show. It's not an abstract concept. You can point to it and say, why does this structure exist that says that this music that won a Pulitzer Prize is not appropriate for children and not appropriate for a learning environment for young people,
right?
Because it celebrates sex or it uses this word. That to me is like, let's figure it out. I'm not a parent yet, so I'm sure there are parents that are going to say, hey, that's not appropriate for my kid. I don't have a kid, so I feel like there's a limitation to my ability to speak to your experience, ma'am or sir or individual, but I am frustrated by that instinct. And it often I feel like it's a shield for racism to say because there's a lot of country stars that you don't object at all who are constantly over sexualizing and performing some of the same things that you will only call out if it's your excuse or the way that you're willing to call out these black artists.
I mean, you said it best.
That's the first thing I've said best on this whole show. It took an hour and 3 minutes. Nice.
I agree with you. I think that there's racism and there's sexism. And one of the things that gets to me is when people try to use feminism as a justification for actually being like anti-sexuality. Like, there's nothing gross about women owning their own sexuality. There's something wrong with it. There's nothing inappropriate about it. And I think that essentially the task of reproduction, like literally reproduction, but as well as social reproduction, is often borne by women and femme people, and that those roles were intentionally degraded. And so that's why women and women's sexuality is frowned upon, because we degrade those things that we don't want to value or give status or power to. And, as a patriarchy, that's what we did. And so therefore women's sexuality must be gross and wrong. And then add on top of that the racial overtones, because, well, apparently some kinds of sexuality are okay, but some are not. Yep. And so that's when I got into the artist that I mentioned before. I thought, well, I just loved it because there's a lot of hip action and a lot of, emphasis. And I was thinking about some of the African dance that I've seen in this community. There's a lot of, proponents and people from West Africa that come and do dance. And
I've seen a lot of really cool stuff.
Yeah. And so then I'm starting to see those influences. I was, and I'm hearing the beats. And I'm like, and I'm getting it. And then like learning more from people who've taught me about their culture or where this art form comes from and the symbols and what it means. And then I appreciate it that much more. So it's kind of like a little bit of education helps me expand my aesthetic quite a bit.
Yeah. No, it's a really good point. It reminds me of I think the puritanical culture is a way for certain people to have control over it. And I think, it reminds me of like alcohol in places in Europe where they're basically like, a 10-year-old having a beer in the or sipping a beer or whatever in the home, or I don't think there are countries where they just don't have a restriction. Of course, I'm not saying that it's okay for young people to abuse alcohol, but you might be disincentivizing them from abusing it because it's not mystified, and then they go off and they have this crazy party like you saw at UO with this picture of all these college students. They had to pack together like, without masks or anything. Well, that's a COVID situation too, but all I'm saying too is that that's a different scenario, I suppose. But yeah, I don't know. I rambled. It's if you teach people that this is a part of human life, then they're not gonna have this like, I'm rebelling against my parents and against society by going heavily into this thing.
Well, you think about why do people make unhealthy choices? That's really when I look about. I mean, I did relationship education as part of a prevention program for women's space, and it was like people would always ask, "Well, why do these women? 'Cause there's always these women, even though it didn't always work that way. Keep choosing these losers that abuse them." And it's sort of like, that's not really what was happening.
Yeah.
A, but B, it's like even looking at myself when like I've made some choices that weren't so kind to myself. When I go back and I look, I say, there's a part of me that was trying to seek this out, this thing, this wound, this healing I needed.
Yeah.
And and the way I worked it out was seeking it through this unhealthy way. And, once I understand that, then I'm able to make a different choice. So I think just providing meaningful, supportive relationships with youth to healthy adults with good boundaries who care about them makes a whole lot of a bigger difference than what, whether they have a sip of beer or not, or whether they see somebody in a bikini or not. It's like, I think, young children shouldn't be exposed to adult things.
Sure.
I don't think it's, it's developmentally appropriate. But I also think that that culture is very diverse. Very diverse.
Yes.
And so, we want when my mom, she taught me to say is for certain things, like certain like words, like what's an appropriate word? We'll say, well, in this place, these folks wouldn't like it if you used like swear words.
Yeah.
But in this place, it's okay. And so she wasn't even teaching me any morality around it. She was just simply saying, well, if you want everybody to be comfortable in this environment, these are the norms, but in this environment, other norms apply, and so it was like kind of learning how to navigate, which is something that I think pretty much every person of color has to do from like as soon as I leave the house, right? But it's also really helpful
code switching
for everyone. Yeah.
Right.
Like what are the norms?
I've talked about how if you handed me a red fruit that had like a little stem sticking out of it, I, as a young kid, would know that is an apple, and I would know that it's a ringo. And just the most formative level, because when you fire it, you wire it in terms of your neurodevelopment, right? I learned that there is not just one, this is not just a phone, it's a denwa. This is not just a key, it's a kagi. And sometimes, no, I'm not going to say there's limitations to that. I think it's great. I think it's great to be pluralistic.
Yeah.
Yeah. The last question I ask you, and I hope that the battery on my phone is still going and they're still being filmed and people aren't just looking at a black screen.
Just lost.
The audio version is just awesome, though. It's definitely here. Like, that's where you want to be. People are scrolling anyway. They're not. If they're still listening, they're on the audio version. Shout out to the people still on YouTube.
Is this live? So I guess you won't be editing it.
Yeah. I want to ask you, Rose, maybe this is the last question. Like, every person has limits and limitations. And what is like a limitation of your candidacy?
You mean, like how
like
am I not awesome?
Yeah.
It's such a hard question to answer.
What a politician.
Right. I think that like my limitations are that, I don't know all there is to know either. Yeah. So, some of the questions like you talked about the polarization in politics. And I think that, that it's easy to get polarized. It's easy to think that folks who don't agree are the enemy. And so I think that I'm vulnerable to that as much as anybody else. But I will also say that I am working on that because I recognize that on another level, like I can connect and engage with almost anyone because I love people and I'm just, that kind of person. So I think that if I get out of my own way, I can do that and just remember that, most people are way better, way better than our worst fears. And so, I think it's a limitation and I think it's something that I need to keep learning more about.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This has been a really cool chat. And I officially endorse Rose Wilde for re-election to the Lane ESD Board.
Well, thank you.
Hopefully we'll chat again sometime.
Well, thank you for doing this.
Yeah.
It's been great. And thank you for watching.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.